I'm Lieutenant Colonel Camilla Kimmel, 39 years old, and I built my career in the Air Force the slow way. No legacy name, no shortcuts, just 2 decades of quiet competence. For years, I kept other people's careers moving, signing the papers that decided who rose and who stalled. But the day a Navy SEAL captain mocked me in front of the entire cafeteria, calling me a secretary, I made a choice that changed everything. Ever been underestimated or humiliated by someone who thought your work didn't matter? If so, tell me in the comments. You're not alone. Before I tell you what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand your ground after being disrespected, hit like and subscribe for more real stories about quiet authority and earned respect. What came next silenced a room full of soldiers and reminded everyone what real power looks like. I stood at the window of my office in the Joint Command Personnel Division, watching the afternoon light slice through the blinds in clean, parallel lines. Outside, the Pacific base hummed with the usual rhythm, jets taxiing on distant runways, vehicles moving between buildings, personnel crossing the quad in their various uniforms. 21 years in the Air Force had taught me that every branch has its own cadence, its own vocabulary of movement and pride. The Army walks with purpose, the Marines with aggression, the Navy with the easy confidence of people who've mastered something most humans fear. And us? We glide. We plan. We make sure everyone else can do their jobs. My path here wasn't remarkable by Hollywood standards. No legacy family, no political connections. My father drove trucks for a living. My mother managed a grocery store in Tucson. When the ROTC scholarship letter arrived during my senior year of high school, my mother cried at the kitchen table, not from sentimentality, but relief. College was possible now. A future was possible. I signed the papers without hesitation, understanding even then that I was trading 4 years of education for at least 8 years of service. It seemed like a fair exchange. I commissioned as a second lieutenant at 23, standing in a gymnasium full of other newly minted officers, all of us bright-eyed and terrified in equal measure. The early years were a blur of additional training, endless briefings, learning to navigate a world where your competence was constantly questioned if you didn't fit a certain profile. I was good at logistics. Better than good, I understood how systems worked, how personnel flowed through the machine of military bureaucracy, how the right person in the right position could change everything. I learned to read evaluation reports like other people read novels, seeing between the lines where someone's career was being quietly destroyed or carefully cultivated. By my early 30s, I'd made captain and was working joint operations at a forward logistics hub. That's where I first really encountered the other branches up close. Not just seeing them around, but working alongside them, learning their cultures and hierarchies. The Navy guys were meticulous about protocol but loose about everything else. The Marines were exactly what you'd expect, loud, proud, and perpetually ready to remind you they were the toughest people in any room. The Army was institutional, deeply hierarchical, obsessed with doctrine. And all of them, at one point or another, made jokes about the Air Force being soft. I never took it personally. Mostly because I knew something they didn't. Every deployment they went on, every piece of equipment they received, every evaluation that determined their next promotion, all of it crossed desks like mine at some point. We weren't the tip of the spear. We were the people who made sure the spear had a tip at all. At 39, I was a lieutenant colonel. 05 in the pay grade structure that theoretically made us all equal across branches. I ran the Personnel Evaluation Division at Joint Command Pacific, which meant I oversaw the promotion review process for Air Force personnel and advised on inter-service evaluations. It was detailed work, the kind that required you to balance regulation with intuition, to know when a report was being honest and when it was being strategic. My team was small but efficient. Major Erin Chu handled the day-to-day processing, while Lieutenant Dana Moreno, fresh from her first duty station, learned the system with the kind of hungry attention I recognized from my own early years. The cafeteria at Joint Command was neutral territory in theory. In practice, it was a daily performance of invisible hierarchies. The SEALs and Marine Raiders clustered at the tables near the windows, their conversation loud and punctuated with laughter. The Army officers took the center section, spreading out with the unconscious entitlement of people who still thought of themselves as the primary service branch. The Navy aviators mixed with the Air Force pilots, trading technical complaints and hangar stories. And people like me, the administrative officers, the logistics coordinators, the personnel managers, we filled in the gaps, eating quickly and returning to work. I'd been called the admin colonel more than once, usually by people who thought administration was something secretaries did. They didn't understand that administration was power in its purest form. Every personnel file, every evaluation report, every promotion recommendation, these were the mechanisms that determined who rose and who stalled. I'd seen brilliant officers plateau because their supervisor couldn't write a decent evaluation. I'd seen mediocre ones advance because they'd mastered the art of looking good on paper. My job was to be the quality control between those two extremes, to make sure competence was actually recognized. I made it a point to mentor younger officers, especially the ones who reminded me of myself, smart, capable, but lacking the swagger that opened doors. Dana was one of them. She'd come to me after her first evaluation, worried that her supervisor's lukewarm language was going to haunt her career. I'd read it, made 2 phone calls, and had a conversation with her chain of command. The revised evaluation was honest and specific. She'd learned an important lesson: advocacy matters, and knowing who to ask for help matters more. The work was invisible by design. When I did my job well, careers progressed smoothly, evaluations were fair, and the system functioned as intended. Nobody sent thank you notes for that. Nobody gave medals for making sure paperwork was accurate. But I'd been at this long enough to know that the invisibility was part of the power. People underestimated what I could do precisely because they didn't understand what I did. The joint command structure meant I interacted with all branches regularly. I'd sit in briefings where Navy commanders presented operational updates, where Marine lieutenant colonels outlined training requirements, where Army majors justified budget requests. And I'd watch how they looked at me, or more accurately, how they didn't. To them, I was background. Necessary, but unimportant. The woman who handled the paperwork so they could handle the real work. I never corrected them. There was no point in explaining that my signature was on their fitness reports, that my recommendations carried weight with the promotion boards, that I'd quietly salvaged careers they didn't even know were in jeopardy. Let them think I was just pushing paper. Let them focus on their operations and medals and combat stories. I'd focus on making sure the system worked. My office overlooked the main quad, and in the late afternoons, I'd watch the physical training formations, the change of shift movements, the constant circulation of personnel that made a base like this function. Somewhere in that flow were the people whose careers I'd influenced, whose evaluations I'd reviewed, whose potential I'd helped unlock. They didn't know my name, most of them. But they'd benefited from my work anyway. That was enough for me. Or at least, I'd convinced myself it was. The new rotation arrived on a Tuesday in October, a fresh group of Navy personnel, including a SEAL detachment that immediately changed the atmosphere in every room they entered. SEALs have a particular energy, not quite arrogance, but close. They'd earned their reputation the hard way, through training that broke most candidates and operations that required a level of mental and physical endurance most people couldn't comprehend. I respected that. But respect didn't require deference, and I'd noticed over the years that some of them never quite learned the difference. The cafeteria became louder. The briefings became more theatrical. And slowly, over the first few weeks, I started noticing a pattern I'd seen before in my career, the subtle reframing of who mattered and who didn't. Combat arms versus support. Operators versus administrators. The people who did real, military work versus the people who just facilitated it. The morning briefings at Joint Command started at 0700 hours sharp, and by the second week of the new rotation, I'd already learned to anticipate the interruptions. Captain Mason Briggs had a talent for redirecting conversations, for inserting himself into discussions that didn't require his input, for making sure everyone in the room knew he was there. He was 44, a Navy SEAL with a chest full of commendations, and the kind of weathered confidence that came from having survived things most people only read about. When he spoke, People listened, not just because of his rank, but because his presence demanded it. I first noticed his attitude during a logistics coordination meeting. I was presenting the new inter-service evaluation timeline, explaining how the updated promotion board schedule would affect all branches. It was technical information, procedural but important. Halfway through my second slide, Briggs leaned back in his chair and said to the officer next to him, just loud enough for the room to hear, "Good thing somebody's keeping track of the paperwork while we handle the actual missions." Laughter rippled through the room, not cruel, just casual. The kind of laugh that said, "We all know what the real work is." I didn't pause, didn't acknowledge it. I finished the brief, answered the relevant questions, and moved on. Commander Evelyn Ross, the Navy liaison officer, caught my eye afterward with an apologetic expression, but I just shook my head slightly. It wasn't worth addressing. Not yet. The pattern continued over the following weeks. Small comments in meetings, casual asides in the hallways, the perpetual undertone that Air Force personnel, especially those of us in administrative roles, were somehow less essential than the operators. I'd heard variations of these jokes for 2 decades. Desk pilots. Clipboard warriors. The implication that unless you were directly engaging the enemy, you were just playing at military service. What bothered me wasn't the disrespect itself. I'd developed thick skin years ago. What bothered me was watching how it affected the younger officers. Dana had started second-guessing herself in meetings, editing her comments before speaking, making herself smaller in professional spaces she had every right to occupy. Major Chu had mentioned that some of the joint task assignments were being distributed unevenly, with the exciting, operational roles going exclusively to combat personnel, while the administrative roles were assumed to belong to support officers. I started paying closer attention to Briggs. Not obviously, I didn't change my routine or make a point of being in the same spaces. But I watched how he operated, how he built his influence. He was good at it, I had to admit. He collected allies through shared experience, through the unspoken bond of having been in combat together. He told stories in the briefing room that subtly established hierarchies, who had proven themselves under fire, who had merely observed from a distance, who had never been tested at all. The cafeteria became his theater. He held court at a table near the windows, surrounded by the younger SEALs and a rotating cast of Marine and Army officers who wanted to be associated with that energy. Their conversations were loud enough to carry, full of operational jargon and war stories that reminded everyone else in the room what real service looked like. I usually ate at 11:30 hours, a habit I developed to avoid the peak lunch rush. I'd grab whatever the day's special was, find a quiet corner table, and spend 20 minutes reading through evaluation reports on my tablet. It was efficient and peaceful, a small pocket of productive solitude in an otherwise collaborative workday. One Thursday in early November, I was halfway through a particularly well-written performance assessment when I heard my rank being called from across the cafeteria. Not my name, my rank. "Hey, Colonel." I looked up. Briggs was standing at his table, 20 feet away, surrounded by at least 8 junior officers. The cafeteria wasn't completely full, but it was populated enough. 50 people, maybe more. Enough for an audience. "Yes, Captain." I kept my voice neutral, my expression polite. "Just curious," he said, that easy smile on his face that made everything sound friendly even when it wasn't. "What exactly does the Personnel Evaluation Division do all day? I mean, what's your actual job?" "Secretary to the real commanders." The laughter started immediately, not malicious, just casual. The reflexive response to a joke told by someone everyone wanted to like. I saw Dana at a table to my left, her face flushing red. I saw Aaron chew halfway through standing up before catching himself. I saw Commander Ross closing her eyes briefly, the expression of someone who knew they were witnessing something that shouldn't be happening, but didn't know how to stop it. I looked at Captain Briggs for exactly 3 seconds. Long enough to acknowledge I'd heard him, short enough not to grant it significance. Then I returned my attention to my tablet, finished the last 2 paragraphs of the evaluation I'd been reading, and closed the file. I collected my tray, disposed of my trash in the designated bins, and walked out of the cafeteria at my normal pace. I didn't hurry. I didn't storm out. I simply left. Behind me, The conversation resumed, louder now, buoyed by the successful landing of a joke. I heard fragments of it as the door closed, something about admin officers, something about knowing your place in the hierarchy. I walked back to my office, sat down at my desk, and opened the next file in my review queue. My hands were steady. My breathing was even. I'd been trained for composure under pressure, and this public dismissal of my competence and authority was just another form of pressure. Dana appeared in my doorway 10 minutes later, visibly upset. "Ma'am, you should have said something." Should have what? I kept my tone gentle but firm. Gotten into a shouting match in the cafeteria? Demanded an apology in front of his peers? Explained why his comment was inappropriate? "Yes," she said, her voice tight. "All of that." I gestured for her to sit down. She did, perched on the edge of the chair like she was ready to spring back up and go defend my honor in the quad. "Lieutenant, respect isn't earned in a cafeteria," I said. "It's not won through arguments or public confrontations. It's demonstrated through competence, consistency, and the authority you actually hold, not the authority you have to loudly claim." "But he embarrassed you," she insisted. "In front of everyone." "He embarrassed himself," I corrected. "He just doesn't know it yet." She looked confused, frustrated. I understood. When you're young and someone disrespects your mentor, your instinct is to fight. Mine had been too, once. But I'd learned slowly, painfully, that some battles are won through patience rather than confrontation. "Go back to work," I told her. "I'm fine." She left, unconvinced but obedient. I returned to my files. That evening, after most of the office had cleared out, I pulled up the personnel action request queue. The promotion board cycle was beginning its final phase, which meant I'd be reviewing the inter-service evaluation summaries for all Joint Command personnel up for advancement. It was routine work, the kind I'd done hundreds of times. Read the file, verify the supporting documents, check for procedural compliance, make recommendations where necessary, and forward to the board. Captain Mason Briggs's file was in the queue. He was up for promotion to 06 Navy Captain, the equivalent of an Air Force or Army Colonel. It was a significant advancement, the threshold where you moved from field command to strategic leadership. His record was impressive: multiple combat deployments, commendations for valor, stellar fitness reports from his chain of command. On paper, he was exactly the kind of officer who deserved promotion. I read through his entire file carefully, noting the procedural elements that would matter to the board. Then I opened the incident report database, a system we maintained for tracking minor disciplinary issues, performance concerns, and behavioral patterns that might not rise to the level of formal reprimands, but still needed to be documented. There were 3 entries for Briggs over the past 18 months. Nothing major: failure to attend a mandatory joint operations briefing, a complaint from an Army liaison about dismissive conduct during a coordination meeting, and a note from a previous command about his tendency to prioritize SEAL team autonomy over joint operational requirements. Individually, they were minor. Collectively, they suggested a pattern. I made notes in my review summary, flagging the entries not as disqualifying factors, but as areas where the promotion board might want additional context. Standard procedure. Thorough, fair, and entirely within my authority as the reviewing officer. Then I saved the file and went home. The base housing unit I'd been assigned was standard issue, 2 bedrooms, basic furniture, walls so thin you could hear your neighbor's television. But it was mine, a space where I didn't have to perform professionalism or manage other people's perceptions. I made dinner, responded to a few emails, and then sat down with my personal journal. I'd kept it sporadically over the years, mostly during difficult periods when I needed to process thoughts I couldn't speak aloud. I wrote one line that night: "They'll know when it's time." Then I closed the journal and went to bed. The promotion board review process at Joint Command was a carefully choreographed sequence of bureaucratic rituals. First came the file preparation phase, where personnel officers like me verified that every document was complete, accurate, and properly formatted. Then came the preliminary review, where senior officers scanned the assembled files for obvious promotions and obvious problems. Finally came the formal board session, where a panel of 06 and above officers made final recommendations that would go up the chain to the service secretaries for approval. For inter-service evaluations, cases where someone from one branch was being assessed for promotion while serving in a joint command, the process was slightly more complex. An officer from the host branch had to verify that the candidate's performance in the joint environment met standards, that they'd contributed effectively to cross-service operations, and that there were no interpersonal or professional issues that might affect their leadership capacity in future joint assignments. I was that officer. It was a role I'd held for 3 years, appointed by Brigadier General Robert Tate, the Air Force senior officer at Joint Command Pacific. I'd earned the position through a combination of experience, attention to detail, and the kind of steady reliability that made superiors comfortable delegating important work. General Tate had told me once, during my initial appointment, "Kimmel, I need someone who won't be swayed by friendship or intimidated by rank. Someone who understands that fairness isn't the same as being nice. Think you can do that?" I'd said yes, and I'd meant it. The morning after the cafeteria incident, I had a scheduled meeting with General Tate to discuss the upcoming board cycle. His office was in the command building, a corner space with windows overlooking the flight line. He was 52, a career officer who'd flown transport missions in 3 different conflicts before transitioning to command roles. He had the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades in the sun and the sharp, assessing gaze of someone who'd survived Pentagon politics. "Kimmel," he said as I entered, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "How's the file prep coming?" "On schedule, sir. I'll have the inter-service evaluations completed by Monday." He nodded, scanning something on his computer screen. Then he looked up at me with an expression I'd learned to recognize, the look that said he'd heard something and was deciding how to address it. "Heard there was an incident in the cafeteria yesterday," he said carefully. "Something about one of the SEAL officers making an inappropriate comment. Word traveled fast on a base." I wasn't surprised. "It was handled, sir." "Handled how?" "I didn't engage. I left the situation and returned to work." He studied me for a long moment. "You know you could have filed a complaint. Disrespect to a superior officer, especially in a public setting, that's a legitimate violation of conduct standards." "Yes, sir. I'm aware. But you chose not to." "I chose not to," I confirmed. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled under his chin. "Mind telling me why?" I considered my words carefully. General Tate wasn't just my superior, he was also someone who'd navigated his own share of institutional disrespect, though for different reasons. He understood the calculations that went into deciding when to fight and when to let actions speak louder. "Because filing a complaint would have made it personal," I said. "It would have been about my hurt feelings or my wounded pride. That's not what this is about." "What is it about?" "It's about making sure he understands the system he's operating in," I said. "Right now, he thinks power comes from combat experience and the respect of his peers. He doesn't understand that power also comes from the people who manage his career progression, who verify his evaluations, who determine whether his record gets forwarded with a strong recommendation or with questions attached." General Tate's expression didn't change, but I saw the slight shift in his eyes that indicated understanding. "You're saying you're going to let the paperwork speak?" "I'm saying I'm going to do my job," I corrected. "Thoroughly, fairly, and by the book. If that means Captain Briggs gets a wake-up call about how authority actually works in a joint command structure, then that's a lesson he should have learned before now." He was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Don't add anything that isn't already in his record. Don't create problems where none exist." "I wouldn't dream of it, sir. But don't ignore problems that do exist, either." "Never have, sir." He dismissed me with a gesture, and I returned to my office feeling the strange calm that came from having a plan, even if that plan was simply to execute my duties with meticulous precision. Over the next few days, I completed the inter-service evaluation reviews for all personnel up for promotion. There were 12 Army officers, 7 Navy, 3 Marines, and 15 Air Force candidates at various grades. Each one received the same level of attention. I read their complete files, verified their supporting documents, checked for any discrepancies or concerns, and wrote summary assessments that would guide the board's deliberations. Captain Briggs's file took me longer than most, not because I was trying to sabotage it, but because I was making absolutely certain that every detail was accurate and properly contextualized. His combat record was exemplary. That went in my summary without qualification. His leadership capabilities were well documented, also noted prominently. His technical proficiency and operational expertise were beyond question, highlighted appropriately. And then, in the section reserved for areas of potential concern, I included the incident reports. Not with commentary, not with editorial judgment, just the facts. 3 documented instances over 18 months where Captain Briggs had demonstrated difficulty with inter-service cooperation, with following joint operational protocols, with treating personnel from other branches as professional equals rather than support staff. I attached the original incident reports as supporting documentation, flagged the file for board review with additional context, and moved on to the next candidate. By Friday afternoon, all the files were complete. I forwarded them to General Tate's office for preliminary review, knowing that he'd check my work before the formal board session. That evening, I went home, made dinner, and allowed myself the luxury of not thinking about work for a few hours. Saturday, I went running on the beach path that bordered the base, letting the rhythm of footfalls and breathing clear my mind. Sunday, I caught up on reading and meal prep for the week. By Monday morning, I was back in my office, ready for whatever came next. What came next was a message from General Tate's aide, asking me to attend the preliminary board review session scheduled for Tuesday at 1300 hours. This was standard. As the inter-service evaluation officer, I was expected to be available to answer questions about any of the candidates I'd reviewed. But something about the timing felt significant. Tuesday arrived with the kind of crystalline weather that made serving in the Pacific almost pleasant. I dressed in my service uniform, made sure my ribbons were properly aligned, and arrived at the conference room 15 minutes early. The preliminary board consisted of General Tate, a Navy Rear Admiral, and an Army Colonel, senior officers from each branch responsible for making sure the promotion recommendations were sound before forwarding them up the chain. The meeting lasted 3 hours. We reviewed each candidate methodically, discussing their qualifications, their potential, their readiness for increased responsibility. When we reached Captain Briggs's file, Admiral Chin, the Navy representative, pulled up the evaluation summary and read through it carefully. Strong operational record, he noted. Multiple commendations, excellent fitness reports. Then he scrolled to the section on concerns. But there's a pattern here of difficulty with joint operations. 3 separate incidents. Kimmel, you flagged this. Can you elaborate? I walked them through the documentation, explaining each incident without embellishment or editorial commentary. The missed briefing. The dismissive conduct. The tendency to prioritize SEAL team autonomy over collaborative requirements. In isolation, these are minor, I concluded. But collectively, they suggest that Captain Briggs may need additional mentorship in joint operational leadership before advancing to 06, where he'll be expected to command across service lines. General Tate looked at Admiral Chin. Your assessment? The Admiral considered for a long moment. He's a good officer. Excellent in his specialty. But Lieutenant Colonel Kimmel has a point. At 06, we need people who understand that military effectiveness requires cooperation, not just individual branch excellence. Recommendation, the Army Colonel asked. Approve the promotion, Admiral Chin said, but include a notation that he needs to complete the joint professional military education course before assuming any command roles in a joint environment. General Tate nodded. Agreed. That'll be our board recommendation. They moved on to the next file. I sat quietly, taking notes, offering clarification when asked. The meeting concluded at 1600 hours, and we filed out into the hallway. General Tate caught my arm gently as I passed. Well done, Kimmel. That was a fair assessment. Just doing my job, sir. He smiled slightly. That's what makes it effective. The formal promotion board was scheduled for the following Monday. Between the preliminary review and the formal session, word began to spread through the command, not through official channels, but through the informal network that existed on every base. People talked. They speculated. They noticed which files had been flagged for additional review. I heard through Aaron Chu that Captain Briggs had been asking questions about the promotion board process, trying to understand how the inter-service evaluations worked. I heard through Dana that some of the SEAL team members were confused about why their captain's advancement wasn't the smooth, automatic process they'd expected. I said nothing, did nothing different from my normal routine. I showed up to work, completed my duties, ate lunch in the cafeteria at my usual time. The cafeteria was different now, though. Not dramatically, no one was avoiding me or treating me like I'd done something scandalous. But there was a subtle shift in how people positioned themselves, how conversations paused and resumed when I entered. The junior officers who'd witnessed the original incident watched me with something that looked like new respect mixed with uncertainty. Captain Briggs still held court at his usual table, still told his stories, still commanded attention. But when I walked past on my way to get coffee, I noticed him glance up, hold my gaze for half a second, then return to his conversation with an expression I couldn't quite read. On Monday morning at 0900 hours, the formal promotion board convened. I wasn't present for the actual deliberations, those were conducted by the senior officers in closed session. But I was available in my office in case they needed additional clarification on any of the evaluations I'd provided. At 11:30 hours, my office phone rang. General Tate's aide, asking me to report to conference room C. When I arrived, the board had already completed their work. General Tate was standing near the window, reviewing a document. Admiral Chin and Colonel Morrison were gathering their materials. They looked up when I entered. Lieutenant Colonel Kimmel, General Tate said formally, the board has completed its review of all promotion candidates. Your inter-service evaluations were thorough and helpful. We wanted to thank you personally before releasing the results. Thank you, sir, I said. Captain Briggs's promotion has been approved, Admiral Chin added, with the stipulation we discussed. He'll need additional training in joint operations before assuming command responsibilities in this environment. I nodded. Understood, sir. He'll be notified this afternoon, General Tate continued. As part of the notification process, he'll need to sign acknowledgement of the board's recommendations and conditions. Since you're the inter-service evaluation officer, you'll be conducting that meeting. There it was. The moment where theory became practice, where the paperwork I'd filed transformed into a face-to-face conversation. Yes, sir, I said. When would you like me to schedule that? 1400 hours today, if possible. Strike while the iron's hot. I'll make it happen, sir. I left the conference room and returned to my office, where I drafted a formal meeting notification to Captain Briggs. Subject: Promotion Board Results. Required Acknowledgement Meeting. Time: 1400 hours. Location: Personnel Evaluation Division, Office 217. I hit send, then spent the next 2 hours reviewing unrelated files and preparing for a completely different meeting about evaluation standardization procedures. At 13:45 hours, I cleared my desk, organized the Briggs promotion documentation into a neat folder, and waited. At 13:58 hours, there was a knock on my door. Come in, I said. Captain Mason Briggs entered, dressed in his service uniform, his expression confident but slightly uncertain. He probably expected a quick administrative meeting, sign some papers, shake hands, get back to celebrating with his team. Then he saw the insignia on my desk, the placard that read Lieutenant Call C. Kimmel, Inter-Service Evaluation Officer, Joint Command Personnel Division. I watched his eyes track from the nameplate to my face, watched the confusion settle in, watched him process the information that hadn't quite clicked before. Captain Briggs, I said, my tone professional and neutral. Please sit down. He sat, his posture military correct, but his eyes now fully alert, reassessing everything he thought he knew about this meeting. I opened the folder and pulled out the promotion board decision document. Congratulations on your promotion to 06 Navy Captain. The board has approved your advancement based on your excellent operational record and demonstrated leadership in combat environments. Thank you, ma'am, he said, his voice carefully controlled. I slid the document across the desk. However, the board has also included a conditional recommendation. Before you assume any command roles in a joint operational environment, You'll need to complete the Joint Professional Military Education course at the National Defense University. This requirement is based on documented patterns of difficulty with inter-service cooperation and joint operational protocols. I watched him read the document, watched his jaw tighten as he processed the implications. The incidents referenced in your evaluation, he said slowly, these were minor procedural issues. They were documented concerns, I corrected, that suggested a pattern of behavior inconsistent with the collaborative requirements of joint command leadership. He looked up at me, and I saw the moment when understanding finally arrived, not just about this meeting, but about the cafeteria, about my role, about the entire structure of authority he'd misunderstood. You wrote the evaluation, he said. I'm the Inter-Service Evaluation Officer, I confirmed. I write all the evaluations for personnel serving in Joint Command who are up for promotion. It's been my responsibility for 3 years. Silence stretched between us. Outside my office window, I could hear the distant sound of aircraft engines, the everyday noise of a base in operation. I'll sign the acknowledgement, he said finally. I handed him a pen. He signed, then slid the document back across the desk. I filed it in the folder, then looked at him directly. Captain Briggs, you're an excellent officer. Your combat record speaks for itself. But Joint Command requires a different skill set than single-service operations. It requires understanding that competence exists across all specialties, not just the ones that involve direct engagement. It requires respecting the people who handle logistics, administration, personnel management, all the systems that make combat operations possible. He nodded slowly, his expression somewhere between chastened and thoughtful. The cafeteria incident last week, I continued, my tone still even, that was a symptom of a larger misunderstanding about how authority works in this environment. You assumed that because my work isn't combat operations, it isn't important. That assumption is what led the board to require additional training. Ma'am, he started, but I held up a hand gently. I'm not looking for an apology. I'm explaining the lesson. Next time you serve in a joint command, you'll know better. You'll understand that the person reviewing your evaluations, the officer signing off on your promotion recommendations, the people ensuring your career progresses smoothly, we're not secretaries. We're the infrastructure of military effectiveness. He met my eyes, and I saw something shift there. Not quite contrition, but definitely awareness. Understood, ma'am, he said. Then we're done here, I said. Congratulations again on your promotion. You've earned it. Use the additional training as an opportunity to become an even better leader. He stood, executed a proper salute, and I returned it. He left my office without another word. I sat back in my chair, closed the folder, and returned to my other work. Outside, the base continued its rhythm. Somewhere, Captain Briggs was probably processing what had just happened, recalibrating his understanding of how power and respect actually functioned in a military structure. And I was here, in my office overlooking the quad, doing the same work I'd done yesterday and would do tomorrow. Reviewing files. Making sure the system worked. Remaining invisible until the moment when invisibility needed to transform into authority. Dana knocked on my door an hour later, her expression cautious. Ma'am? I heard you had a meeting with Captain Briggs. I did, I confirmed. How did it go? I smiled slightly. About as expected. He signed the acknowledgement. He'll complete the required training. And I suspect he'll think twice before making assumptions about administrative officers in the future. She grinned, relief and satisfaction mixing on her face. That's perfect. It's not perfect, I corrected gently. It's just fair. That's all we're aiming for here, fairness. Not revenge, not humiliation. Just making sure people understand the actual scope of authority and competence in this environment. She nodded, absorbing the distinction. Thank you for letting me see how this works, ma'am. I'm learning a lot. Good, I said. Now get back to work. We have 20 more evaluations to process before the end of the week. She left, and I returned to my files, feeling the satisfaction of a job properly executed. Not dramatically, not with fireworks or confrontation. Just through patience, precision, and the power of properly documented evidence. Sometimes, that's exactly what justice looks like. The change in the cafeteria was subtle at first, the kind of shift you only notice if you're paying attention to social dynamics rather than just moving through space. The volume didn't drop when I entered anymore, but there was a new quality to the ambient awareness. People tracked my movement peripherally, not with fear or hostility, but with the kind of attention reserved for someone whose position has been clarified. Captain Briggs still ate at his usual table with the SEAL team, still told his stories, still commanded attention from the younger officers. But when I walked past with my tray, he looked up and nodded, a small, precise acknowledgement that carried more weight than any apology could have. I returned the nod and continued to my corner table. No words exchanged, no grand gestures. Just mutual recognition that our understanding had shifted. Dana noticed it too. "Everyone's different around you now," she said one afternoon, standing in my office doorway with a stack of evaluation files. Even the ones who weren't in the cafeteria that day. "Word travels," I said simply. "People talk. They piece together stories from fragments of information. And eventually, those stories reshape how they understand authority." Is that what you wanted? I considered the question carefully. I wanted to do my job fairly and thoroughly. If that incidentally educated people about the structure of Joint Command, then that's a beneficial side effect. She smiled, setting the files on my desk. "You're very good at making things sound procedural when they're actually pretty satisfying." Part of the skill set, I acknowledged. The reality was that nothing dramatic had happened. Captain Briggs had been promoted, exactly as his combat record merited. He'd been given additional training requirements, exactly as his documented pattern of behavior justified. I'd facilitated both outcomes through the normal channels of my responsibility. The system had worked precisely as designed. But the ripple effects of that system working correctly, those were harder to quantify and more interesting to observe. The junior officers who'd witnessed the cafeteria incident started carrying themselves differently. Not arrogantly, but with a new confidence that came from understanding that authority could be quiet, that power didn't always announce itself loudly, that competence manifested in multiple forms. Dana stopped editing herself in meetings. Aaron Chu started pushing back more effectively when operational officers tried to skip procedural requirements. Even the other senior officers adjusted their approach. I noticed more requests for consultation on evaluation wording, more questions about how to properly document performance, more awareness that the administrative infrastructure wasn't just background noise. It was the mechanism that determined career progression. Commander Evelyn Ross stopped by my office one morning, ostensibly to discuss a Navy personnel file, but clearly carrying a different conversation. She closed the door behind her, which was unusual for what should have been a routine discussion. "I wanted to say something," she started, then paused, choosing her words. "About how you handled the Briggs situation." "I didn't handle a situation," I said carefully. "I processed a promotion review according to standard procedures." She smiled. "Right. And it was masterfully executed standard procedure." What he said in that cafeteria was unprofessional and disrespectful. You could have made an official complaint, created a disciplinary incident, forced apologies, and formal reprimands. Which would have made me look defensive and him look like a victim of political correctness, I finished. "Exactly. Instead, you let the system demonstrate its own authority. You showed everyone, not just him, that dismissing administrative competence is strategically stupid because we're the ones who manage career infrastructure." I nodded slowly. "Commander, are you telling me this helped beyond just correcting one officer's misconceptions?" "I'm telling you that 3 of my junior Navy officers have asked me about transferring to personnel specialties in the past week. They watched what happened and realized that administrative expertise is actually a form of power, not a consolation prize for people who can't do real, military work." That caught my attention. One of the persistent challenges in Joint Commands was recruiting talented officers into personnel and logistics roles. Most ambitious young officers gravitated toward operational specialties, viewing support roles as career dead ends. If what had happened with Briggs had somehow reframed that perception, even slightly, then the impact was larger than I'd anticipated. "That's good to hear," I said genuinely. "It's more than good," Ross continued. "It's changing the culture, at least in this command. People are understanding that effectiveness isn't just about combat proficiency. It's about the entire ecosystem of military operations. After she left, I sat with that information for a while, trying to process what it meant. I'd spent 21 years navigating a system that consistently undervalued administrative competence. I'd watched talented officers plateau because they chose personnel management over pilot training, logistics over infantry command. I'd internalized the message that my work was necessary but not prestigious, important but not celebrated. And now, because I'd simply done my job thoroughly and visibly, that narrative was shifting, at least in this small corner of the military world. The thought was satisfying and uncomfortable in equal measure. I hadn't set out to change institutional culture. I just wanted to make sure one arrogant officer understood the scope of his misconceptions. But individual actions rippled outward in ways you couldn't always predict or control. That evening, I attended a mandatory joint operations briefing where all senior officers from the various branches gathered to discuss upcoming training exercises. These meetings were usually efficient but impersonal. People presented their sections, answered questions, and moved on. This time, when I presented the personnel readiness assessment, something was different. People leaned forward slightly. Officers who usually checked their phones during administrative updates kept their attention on the briefing slides. When I finished, there were substantive questions, not just pro forma acknowledgments, but actual engagement with the information. General Tate noticed too. After the meeting, as people filed out, he lingered near the door until the room cleared. "You've changed something here, Kimmel," he said without preamble. "Sir?" "The respect level for administrative operations. The awareness that personnel management is strategic work. A month ago, half these officers would have tuned out during your section of the brief. Today, they actually listened." I didn't know how to respond to that without sounding either falsely modest or inappropriately proud, so I just nodded. "Keep doing what you're doing," he continued. "The military needs more officers who understand that leadership isn't just about commanding troops in combat. It's about managing the systems that make combat possible. You're demonstrating that lesson effectively." He left before I could formulate a proper response. I gathered my materials and headed back to my office, processing the unexpected recognition. The next few weeks settled into a new normal. The cafeteria remained socially complex, but no longer felt like navigating hostile territory. The briefings continued with their new dynamic of actual engagement rather than passive attendance. Captain Briggs maintained his professional distance, neither hostile nor particularly friendly, which suited me fine. And then something unexpected happened. It was a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after the promotion board results had been finalized. I was reviewing a complex evaluation case, an Army major with an excellent operational record, but concerning supervisory feedback, when my office phone rang. "Lieutenant Colonel Kimmel," I answered. "Ma'am, this is Chief Petty Officer Ford from the SEAL Detachment. Captain Briggs would like to request a meeting with you, if you have time available this week." I checked my calendar. "I have availability Thursday at 1000 hours. "That works, ma'am." "He'll be there." Thursday arrived with the kind of overcast weather that made the Pacific feel less tropical and more like any other military installation. Captain Briggs appeared at my door at exactly 1000 hours, in his working uniform, his expression serious but not defensive. "Captain," I said, gesturing to the chair. "What can I do for you?" He sat, clearly uncomfortable, which was unusual for someone normally so assured. "Ma'am, I wanted to have a conversation about the inter-service evaluation process. Not to contest my results," he added quickly, "but to better understand how it works." I leaned back in my chair, curious where this was going. "What specifically do you want to understand?" "How you balance operational performance with other factors," he said. "My entire career, I've been evaluated primarily on mission success and combat effectiveness. But the Joint Command evaluation included things I didn't even realize were being documented: missed briefings, conduct reports, cooperation assessments. How do you weigh all that against someone's core job performance?" It was a fair question, asked without defensiveness. I pulled up a blank evaluation template on my computer and rotated the monitor so he could see it. "Joint Command evaluations are multidimensional," I explained. Yes, your primary duty performance matters most. That's why your combat record was weighted heavily and why you were promoted. But at 06, you're moving into strategic leadership. That requires different competencies than tactical excellence. I walked him through the evaluation framework, explaining how we assessed not just what someone accomplished, but how they accomplished it, how they interacted with personnel from other branches, how they contributed to the larger joint mission rather than just their service-specific objectives. He listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions. This wasn't the swagger I'd seen in briefings or the dismissive attitude from the cafeteria. This was an intelligent officer genuinely trying to understand a system he'd operated in without fully comprehending. I never thought about leadership this way, he admitted. In the SEAL teams, leadership is direct. You take care of your people, complete the mission, demonstrate competence under fire. That's the whole framework. That's effective leadership in one context, I agreed. But joint command requires additional skills. You need to understand how logistics supports operations, how personnel management affects unit readiness, how administrative systems create the foundation for mission success. When you called me a secretary in that cafeteria, you weren't just being disrespectful to me personally. You were revealing that you fundamentally misunderstood how joint command authority works. He nodded slowly. I've been thinking about that. A lot. And I wanted to say, not as an excuse, but as context, that I've spent my entire career in environments where the only thing that mattered was operational capability. Everything else was considered secondary. Coming into a joint command, I brought those assumptions with me. I understand that, I said. And I'm not interested in prolonged apologies or self-flagellation. What matters is whether you learn from the experience and adjust your approach accordingly. That's why I'm here, he said. I'm trying to learn. The JPME course doesn't start for another 6 weeks. I was hoping you might be willing to provide some informal mentorship in the meantime, help me understand the systems I'll be operating in more effectively. I was surprised. This was not where I'd expected this conversation to go. You want me to mentor you on Joint Command Administration? Yes, ma'am. If you're willing. I realize I'm asking for a significant time commitment from someone I disrespected publicly. But I'm asking anyway, because I think you could teach me things I need to know that the formal course might not cover. I studied him carefully, trying to assess whether this was genuine humility or strategic image management. His expression was open, his body language suggested sincerity, but I'd been in the military long enough to know that some people were excellent performers. Let me think about it, I said finally. I'll give you an answer by Monday. Fair enough, ma'am. Thank you for considering it. After he left, I sat with the request for a long time. The cynical part of me suspected this was reputation management. He'd realized that having a contentious relationship with the personnel evaluation officer was professionally unwise, so he was trying to repair the damage. The more generous interpretation was that he was genuinely trying to become a better leader by addressing his blind spots. Probably it was both. People rarely had purely single motivations. I thought about what Dana had said, about teaching through example, about modeling the kind of leadership that didn't require volume or confrontation. If I refused this request, I'd be within my rights. He'd been disrespectful, and I owed him nothing. But if I agreed, I might actually help shape how he understood joint operations, which would benefit every person he commanded in the future. That weekend, I called Commander Ross and asked for her assessment. She'd worked with Briggs in operational contexts and might have insight into whether his request was genuine. He's been different since the promotion board, she told me. Quieter in meetings, more willing to listen to input from non-SEAL personnel. I think the lesson actually landed. Whether it's permanent or just temporary adjustment, I can't say. But the change is real, at least for now. Monday morning, I sent Captain Briggs an email. Captain, I'm willing to provide informal mentorship on joint command systems and administrative infrastructure. We'll meet weekly for 1 hour, starting this Thursday at 1500 hours. Come prepared with specific questions about topics you want to understand better. His response came within 30 minutes. Thank you, ma'am. I'll be prepared. And that's how, improbably, Captain Mason Briggs became someone I invested time in teaching, rather than someone I simply processed through the promotion system. It wasn't friendship. We maintained professional distance and formal address. But it was a form of trust being rebuilt through shared commitment to improved understanding. The first few sessions were awkward. He asked careful questions, I provided detailed answers, and we both navigated the strange dynamic of mentor and mentee when just months earlier we'd been in implicit conflict. But slowly, the conversations became more natural. He started to genuinely grasp how personnel systems worked, how evaluation reports shaped careers, how administrative decisions created the conditions for operational success. And watching him learn reminded me why I'd chosen this career path in the first place, not for recognition or glory, but because helping people understand systems allowed them to work within those systems more effectively. Whether I was mentoring a young lieutenant like Dana or teaching a combat veteran like Briggs, the core mission was the same: improve understanding, increase competence, make the military more effective at its fundamental purpose. 3 months after that first meeting in my office, Captain Briggs completed his JPME course at the National Defense University. He sent me a brief email. Ma'am, the course was valuable, but the informal mentorship prepared me for it in ways the syllabus couldn't have anticipated. Thank you for taking the time. Respectfully, Briggs. I filed the email without responding. Some acknowledgments don't require replies. The real evidence of change came during a joint training exercise 2 weeks later when I observed him working with an Air Force logistics team. He listened more than he spoke. He asked questions about their processes. When he disagreed with their timeline, he framed it as a question rather than a correction. Help me understand the supply chain constraints you're working with. The logistics NCOs responded with detailed explanations, and he adjusted his operational planning accordingly. Small moment, easily overlooked. But it represented a fundamental shift in how he understood collaboration. After the briefing, as people filed out, he stopped near my position. That's what you meant about asking questions rather than assuming incompetence. That's exactly what I meant, I confirmed. He nodded and continued out. No dramatic declaration, no grand statement about lessons learned. Just quiet acknowledgement that understanding had deepened. That was satisfying in a way that vindication or revenge could never be, seeing someone actually integrate lessons rather than just perform contrition. The reassignment orders arrived on a Wednesday in March, exactly 8 months after the cafeteria incident that had somehow become the organizing event of this chapter of my career. I read them twice, processing the implications. Promotion to 06, full colonel in the Air Force. Reassignment to Air Force Personnel Command Headquarters at Joint Base San Antonio. Effective date, June 1st, allowing for proper transition and change of command procedures. I'd known the promotion was coming, my record was strong, my current assignment was considered successful, and I'd been at 05 long enough that advancement was statistically likely. But seeing it in official orders, seeing the concrete end date for my time at Joint Command Pacific, triggered a complex mix of feelings I hadn't fully anticipated. 21 years in the Air Force, and I'd learned to navigate transitions smoothly. This was just another reassignment, another duty station, another opportunity to serve. But it also marked the end of something I couldn't quite name, a period where I'd finally felt the impact of my work extending beyond just processing paperwork efficiently. I called my parents that evening, giving them the news. My mother cried, which made me laugh because she'd cried when I commissioned and cried when I made captain and cried at every subsequent promotion. Colonel Kimmel, she kept saying. My daughter, the colonel. I'm not there yet, Mom. 3 more months. But you will be. I'm so proud of you, Camilla. My father took the phone. What does this mean for where you'll be stationed? San Antonio. Air Force Personnel Command. I'll be working strategic policy on evaluation systems and promotion boards. Important work, he said in his practical way. Someone has to make sure the system works right. That's the idea. We talked for another 20 minutes, catching up on family news and neighborhood gossip. When I hung up, I felt the familiar distance of military life, proud of what I'd accomplished, grateful for their support, but fundamentally operating in a world they could only partly understand. The next morning, I informed General Tate of my orders. He nodded, unsurprised. I knew this was coming. The Pentagon specifically requested you for the policy role. They're trying to modernize how we evaluate officers across joint commands, and they need someone who understands both the administrative systems and the political dynamics. I'm honored, sir. You should be. It's a significant role. But it also means we need to find your replacement here, which won't be easy. You've changed the culture of this division more than you probably realize. That evening, I met Dana and Aaron for dinner off base, a small tradition we'd developed for marking significant events. Dana had made captain the previous month. Aaron was up for promotion to lieutenant colonel. Both of them would remain at Joint Command for at least another year. I can't believe you're leaving, Dana said, not quite managing to keep the disappointment out of her voice. I know it's a promotion and it's great for your career, but I'm going to miss having you here. You'll be fine, I assured her. Better than fine. You've learned the systems, you understand the politics, and you've developed your own leadership style. That's all preparation for eventually running this kind of division yourself. That's years away, she protested. Not as many as you think. The military moves faster than you realize when you're actually competent. Aaron raised his glass. To Colonel Kimmel, who taught us that power doesn't have to announce itself loudly to be effective. We toasted, and I felt the weight of legacy settling in unexpected ways. I'd mentored dozens of officers over my career, provided guidance and support and professional development. But these two had witnessed a moment when theory became practice, when I demonstrated rather than just explained how authority could manifest quietly but decisively. The next 3 months passed in the structured chaos of military transition. I trained my replacement, a thorough but less experienced lieutenant colonel who would need time to develop the institutional relationships I'd cultivated. I completed final evaluations for all personnel in my division. I prepared comprehensive transition documentation so nothing fell through the administrative cracks. And I noticed, during those final months, how the dynamic at Joint Command had stabilized into something healthier than when I'd arrived. The cafeteria no longer felt like a performance of dominance hierarchies. The briefings included genuine cross-service collaboration rather than competitive posturing. Junior officers from all branches sought mentorship from senior personnel regardless of specialty, operations officers learning from logistics experts, combat veterans asking questions of personnel managers. Small changes, incremental improvements. But collectively, they represented a culture where competence was recognized across specialties, where administrative expertise was valued rather than dismissed. Captain Briggs, now selected for command of a joint task force that would deploy in the fall, stopped by my office during my final week. He carried a wooden plaque, which he set on my desk with careful formality. "Ma'am, the SEAL detachment wanted to present you with this as you transition to your new assignment." I picked it up, reading the engraved text, Lieutenant Col Camilla Kimmel, in recognition of exemplary leadership in joint operations and dedication to professional development across all service branches. Joint Command Pacific SEAL Detachment, 2025. This wasn't necessary, I said, genuinely surprised. It was absolutely necessary, he corrected. You changed how we think about Joint Command. Not just me, the entire detachment. We're better officers because you took the time to teach us what we didn't know we needed to learn. I looked at him, seeing not the arrogant captain from the cafeteria, but someone who'd actually integrated difficult lessons. Captain, command your task force well. Remember that your success depends on dozens of people whose work isn't combat operations, but is absolutely essential. Treat them accordingly. I will, ma'am. He saluted, I returned it, and he left. I set the plaque on my desk, looking at it for a long moment. Recognition from the people who'd initially dismissed my authority, that meant something. Not because I needed their validation, but because it confirmed that the lesson had actually landed. My departure ceremony was scheduled for the last Friday of May, a formal but brief event in the base's main conference facility. These ceremonies followed a predictable pattern: remarks from senior officers, presentation of awards, official change of responsibility, final salute. I'd attended dozens of them over my career, sometimes as an observer, occasionally as the person departing. This time, I was surprised by the attendance. The room was more crowded than I'd expected, not just my immediate division, but personnel from across the Joint Command. Navy officers I'd worked with on evaluation boards. Army officers whose promotion files I'd processed. Marines I'd consulted with on cross-service assignments. And notably, the entire SEAL detachment, standing in formation at the back of the room. General Tate delivered remarks that were more personal than the usual formulaic praise. He talked about how effective leadership didn't always look dramatic, how the best officers sometimes operated invisibly until the moment when visibility mattered most. He noted that I'd changed the professional culture of the command through patience, precision, and unwavering commitment to fairness. When he presented my Legion of Merit Award, citing my exceptional contributions to joint operations and personnel management, the room erupted in applause that lasted longer than protocol typically permitted. I stood at attention, accepting the recognition with the same composure I'd maintained throughout my career, but internally feeling something I'd rarely allowed myself, pride that wasn't just personal but communal. After the ceremony, there was a reception where people offered congratulations and shared their own versions of what my work had meant. Dana told me I'd taught her that leadership could be quiet but uncompromising. Aaron said I'd demonstrated that administrative competence was its own form of authority. Commander Ross thanked me for changing how Navy personnel thought about joint operations. And Captain Briggs, in a brief private conversation near the refreshment table, said simply, "Ma'am, you made me a better officer by refusing to let me remain ignorant." That's the most valuable gift a leader can give. I left the reception early, preferring not to linger in farewell sentimentality. I'd never been comfortable with prolonged goodbyes or emotional declarations. The work spoke for itself. The changes I'd helped implement would continue without me. The officers I'd mentored would carry forward the lessons in their own careers and pass them to the next generation. That was legacy enough. The weekend before my departure, I drove to the beach overlook where I sometimes went to think. The Pacific stretched out in endless blue-gray, waves rolling in their ancient rhythm. I thought about the path that had brought me here, from that grocery store parking lot in Tucson where I'd read my ROTC acceptance letter, through 2 decades of service in a system that consistently undervalued the work I was best at, to this moment where I was leaving with recognition and respect from people who'd initially dismissed my authority. I'd spent years being invisible, facilitating other people's careers while my own advanced through steady competence rather than dramatic heroics. I'd made peace with that invisibility, understanding it as the price of working in administrative systems. But the cafeteria incident and its aftermath had revealed something I hadn't fully understood before, that invisibility could transform into visibility when the moment required it, that authority didn't need constant performance to remain real. The lesson wasn't about revenge or vindication. It was about understanding that power manifests in multiple forms, that competence creates its own authority regardless of whether it's immediately recognized, and that sometimes the most effective leadership is the kind that works through systems rather than against them. As the sun set over the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, I allowed myself a rare moment of satisfaction. Not because I'd proven something to Captain Briggs or corrected his misconceptions, but because I'd demonstrated, to myself as much as anyone, that the work I'd chosen mattered. Personnel management, evaluation systems, administrative infrastructure, these weren't consolation prizes for people who couldn't do real military work. They were the foundation that made all other military work possible. And now I was being promoted to colonel and sent to help shape those systems at the strategic level, to influence policy that would affect how the entire Air Force evaluated and promoted its officers. The invisibility was ending, not because I demanded recognition, but because the work had spoken loudly enough that people finally heard it. I drove back to my quarters as darkness settled over the base. Tomorrow, I'd begin final packing. Next week, I'd process out paperwork and close this chapter of my career. By June, I'd be in San Antonio, starting new work with new challenges and new opportunities to improve systems that shaped thousands of careers. But tonight, I sat in my small base housing unit, opened my journal, and wrote a final entry for this assignment. Authority isn't in the shouting or the medals. It's in the silence that follows your name when you've earned respect through competence, consistency, and the courage to execute your responsibilities without apology. I came here as an invisible administrator. I'm leaving as a colonel who changed how Joint Command understands the relationship between administration and authority. That transformation happened not through confrontation, but through patience, precision, and trusting that the systems I understood could speak louder than any argument I might make. The lesson is simple: know your power. Use it wisely. And understand that sometimes the most effective way to demonstrate authority is to let the work speak for itself. I closed the journal and prepared for bed, feeling the quiet satisfaction of a chapter properly concluded. Not with dramatic resolution or emotional catharsis, but with the same steady competence that had defined my entire career. The next morning, I woke at 0500 hours, went for my usual run along the beach path, and returned to begin the day's work. 3 more days at Joint Command Pacific, then transition leave, then San Antonio, and the next phase of my career. As I drove to the office, I passed the cafeteria where the incident had occurred 8 months earlier. Through the windows, I could see the morning breakfast crowd, officers from all branches mixing without the rigid hierarchy that had once defined the space. The cultural shift wasn't complete, and it wasn't solely my doing. But I'd contributed to it, demonstrated that authority could be quiet but decisive, that respect could be earned through competence rather than demanded through volume. My car pulled past the windows, sunlight flashing off the windshield, and I continued toward the personnel building. There was work to complete, transitions to finalize, files to process. The same work I'd been doing for 21 years, now carrying the weight of demonstrated impact. I parked, gathered my materials, and headed into the building. The security guard at the entrance nodded with genuine respect. "Morning, Colonel." Not Lieutenant Colonel. Just Colonel, acknowledging the promotion that would be official in 7 days. "Morning," I replied and continued to my office. The day unfolded in its structured rhythm: meetings, evaluations, coordination with my replacement. Routine work that would continue long after I left. And that was exactly as it should be. Systems outlasted individuals. Institutions transcended personalities. The best legacy was building structures that functioned effectively regardless of who operated them. At 1700 hours, I shut down my computer, organized my desk for the final time, and looked around the office that had been my professional home for 3 years. The window overlooking the quad. The bookshelf with regulation manuals and leadership texts. The plaques and certificates that marked successful completion of various duties. Tomorrow, I'd pack it all up. But tonight, I'd leave it as it was: a workspace where important work had been done, where careers had been shaped, where authority had been demonstrated through precision and patience rather than volume and confrontation. I turned off the lights and headed home, ready for the next chapter. Not because I was running from this one, but because I'd completed what I came here to do. The lesson had been taught, the culture had shifted, and the work would continue. That was all any officer could hope for: to leave things better than you found them, to improve systems rather than just operate within them, and to demonstrate that authority manifests in multiple forms, all of them valid when executed with competence and integrity. As I drove off the base for the final time that evening, past the cafeteria windows now dark for the night, I allowed myself one last moment of reflection. Then I focused forward, towards San Antonio and the next mission, carrying with me the understanding that invisibility and authority weren't opposites. They were sometimes the same thing, waiting for the moment when demonstration became necessary. And when that moment came, I'd be ready. Just as I'd always been. That's where I'll leave it. Your turn. Have you ever been publicly underestimated? What did you do in the moment? When have you used quiet authority instead of confrontation, and did it work? If you were in that cafeteria, what would you have done differently? If this resonated, tap like, subscribe for more true stories about boundaries and earned respect, and drop your story below. I read every comment.